I'm good to go, yeah.
All right, cool. So our next speaker here is to tell a tale of two connected medical devices. Please put your hands together for Saurabh, and he is, off you go.
Hey everyone, thank you for showing up. Before I start, I just want to give a quick shout out to BSides Toronto for the opportunity to present today. I'd also like to give a shout out to one of my friends, Nick Tulowski, who also contributed to this research but couldn't be here today. RIP, Nick. I am Saurabh. I work at Mandiant, and much like everyone else these days, I'm also a red teamer, also a wannabe reverse engineer. And for all the recruiters in the house, I'm also all those fancy things. This is what the agenda for the talk looks like. Time filler, time filler, time filler, case study 1, case study 2, time filler. All right, so I'll start off with a small introduction to connected medical devices. I'll talk about the architecture and workflow, some real-world attacks of the medical devices, followed by the case studies of 2 case studies, where I'll talk about the vulnerabilities we discovered in 2 different connected medical devices. Followed by the closing remarks. I know I only got 25 minutes. The presentation on my laptop was more updated because I removed a few slides, so I'll just walk through them because I had to pull it out from the USB drive, which isn't updated. Before I start, I want to have the disclaimer up there. This talk is not about bashing anyone, so I won't be naming any vendors or devices during the talk, and I apologize for heavily redacted screenshots that might put CIA to shame. Also, these devices are widely deployed in a lot of financial institutions, so there's another reason. Also, I got contacted by FDA and FBI before my last talk at Black Hat, so that's another reason. I've tried to classify medical devices here in 5 different categories. So the first category, you'd be most familiar with it. So your fitness activity trackers, sleep pattern monitors would fall in the first category. And so then there are patient monitoring devices like insulin pump, BP monitors, heart rate monitors, ECG, glucose monitors. Then there are IVD or in vitro devices that comprises of HIV detection system, blood analyzers. And all the devices that I've talked about so far, they are usually external to patient's body, hopefully. And then there are devices that are embedded in patient's body, and the most common example would be a pacemaker. And then there are these huge, bulky, stationary medical equipments that you see lying around at the hospital, like medical dispensing system, MRI, X-ray machines, CT scanners. These devices are also referred to as legacy medical devices. They were never meant to be connected to the network. But people are thinking, we're connecting everything to the network. Why not these devices? So, all right. So I just talked about how some devices were never built to be connected to the network or internet. And all these devices are being connected to the network using serial to Ethernet converters, and that's a terrible, terrible idea. These devices, they communicate over the serial communication port, which doesn't have any security built into them. In fact, Department of Homeland Security last year, they issued an alert against one of the most commonly used serial to Ethernet converters called Endport. They're developed by a company, Moxa. And so there were few vulnerabilities that were disclosed. First one was that an attacker could extract sensitive information from these devices, unauthenticated, and of course, remotely. The other vulnerability would allow an attacker to downgrade or upgrade the firmware, also unauthenticated, also remotely. And as if that was not enough, there's another third buffer overflow vulnerability, which would allow an attacker to achieve remote code execution remotely as well. So a terrible idea to use these devices, and if you must use these devices, then it's better to lock them down. I'm not sure if you remember the unscheduled power outage that happened in Ukraine in 2015. That was also caused by some attackers corrupting the firmware on these devices remotely. All right, so jump on to case study 1. So the first device that we looked at was an infusion pump. An IV infusion pump is usually used to inject fluid, medication, nutrients into patient's body in a controlled manner. It's got some safety features built into it. So you can set soft and hard limits. So for example, your doctor could set a hard limit on morphine for 100 milligrams, and once that is set, if a patient wants to inject more morphine, they can't. They used to be standalone devices, but they're now connected to the network. All right, so I've tried to lay out what a typical workflow of an insulin pump would look like. So it's usually connected to the hospital's private network using Wi-Fi or Ethernet. It talks to different subsystems on the hospital network, primarily to a pump server. And a pump server is a server that stores different configuration information like patient name, what medication would apply to a particular patient, in what proportion, so on and so forth. This is typical for medical devices that they are usually maintained by the manufacturers. So the IT technicians at the hospital usually do not have a lot of access to the medical devices. It's sort of like a black box to them because they're heavily maintained by the manufacturers themselves. And to do that, manufacturers may gain access to the device via VPN through the hospital's enterprise gateway. So to start with, in our lab setup, we only had the infusion pump. We didn't have a pump server. It wasn't connected to a network. It didn't have any real-world data. So we made some initial observations. So it had capability to connect over Ethernet or wireless, had a USB port, also an IRDA port. It had a touchscreen display pad, a keypad, and there was also a maintenance mode. So as soon as we found out about the maintenance mode, I frantically started Googling, looking for any manufacturer's guide to see if there's a default password somewhere. And surely there was. And because no one ever changes those passwords, that's just too difficult to do, that worked. And so we gained access to the maintenance mode. It was a lot more restricted mode than I hoped for. So we could access some configurations. We could change a bit of configurations, but not really a whole lot. There was an option to upgrade or downgrade the firmware, but I'm not that technical, so I didn't go that route. All right, so one of the things we saw that because it was just a standalone device at that point of time, the next step for us was to connect it to our own wireless network in the lab. So we spun up a wireless access point, gave it the same AP name as configured in the infusion pump, configured it to the same security settings, but obviously it didn't connect because the wireless settings on the infusion pump had a username and password configured, which we didn't have. And surprisingly, the maintenance mode also did not give me the option to change the username and password. But we did see an option to export the network configurations on the medical device through IRDA. So we went on eBay, the gift that never stops giving, and bought a PDA. I think we bought it for $15 or something. So the idea was to get the PDA to talk to the infusion pump over the IRDA and see if we can exchange some data. So we bought the PDA, we brought it back to the lab environment, and we were able to connect it to the infusion pump easily. No authentication required there, just the bro code, and it worked. And so what we did was after that, we beamed the settings from the infusion pump to the PDA, and we were so excited at that point of time. As soon as it was done, I opened up the settings in the Notes app of the PDA, and well, it was blank. So someone from the manufacturer side, I guess, figured that it's not a good idea to export sensitive data to a foreign device. So that's good of them, but we hit a dead end at that point of time. So at that point of time, we were just sitting with this blank template, which just didn't have any information. And you know how they say when life gives you lemon, make lemonade. So we did what you usually do to a template. We filled it. We filled it with our favorite network setting, wireless settings. We gave our own AP name, our own username, and our own password, security settings, and all that. And then we beamed it back to the infusion pump. And we had no hope. Out of everything that had to work or that didn't work, this worked. So when we beamed it back to the infusion pump, it overrode the settings of the infusion pump from the setting of our template. Go figure. So yeah, so really happy that worked. Did not expect it to work. But now at this point of time, we were happy because the infusion pump was connected to our wireless network. So we made some more observations at that point of time. We noticed that it had Telnet, FTP, and SSH enabled. We tried to brute force the login. That didn't work. I think we need a better word list. We also noticed that as soon as it connected to the wireless network, it started looking for a pump server. And from previous passive research, we knew that infusion pumps usually talk to a pump server, so no surprises there. But the problem was that we did not have a pump server in the lab environment. So we spun up a virtual machine, gave it the same net bias name as this guy was looking for, and spun it up, let it go, installed Wireshark on it, also Netcat. So at that point of time, we started getting some traffic from the infusion pump. So we saw that the initial packet had a proprietary protocol, but was loosely based on XML. So it was easy to decipher. We got information like pump serial number, current time, wireless access point data, IP MAC information, maintenance due date. At the end, there was a checksum. After a while, we figured that it was just an X modem checksum, so it was easy to spoof. So we wanted to automate the process of fuzzing, so we quickly wrote a Python script that would sit and act as like an application server or a pump server, receive messages from the infusion pump, and so we could analyze the traffic and then start sending different kind of responses back to the infusion pump and see what happens. Took us many hours to go through this process, many different iterations, but we started figuring out that there was a pattern to it. Started deciphering the packet information from the packets that were coming from the infusion pump and what kind of response would it be expecting. So we figured a different message type. So there was message type 2, which basically confirmed to the pump that you are now connected to the pump server. Then there was message type 7 and 31. We're not really sure what they are. Then there's message type 8. And when you send message type 8 after or followed by message type 2, it changes the status of the infusion pump from none to receiving. So at this point of time, you might modify an existing packet and send it back to the infusion pump, and it'll override some settings on the infusion pump. Message type 20 was network commands. We're still working on it. I think there's something interesting there, but not really sure what it does. And then there's message type 208 and 238. Just not sure what they are. So during this whole process, we found a winning packet. So essentially, when we sent a message type 2 followed by message type 8, we got this packet from the infusion pump. And a lot of data is redacted, but if you can see, I've highlighted there are several headers there. So there's a drug name, the dosage in there. You can see the care area, and there's patient, location, route, site, caregiver information, and all the information. And some of the information is blank here because our infusion pump did not have any data. But in a real-world scenario where this is deployed and is used, all that information will be in there. And once you capture this packet, you can also overwrite data on this packet and then push it back to the infusion pump, and it will override settings. So we thought that was kind of cool. The other thing we were able to get was get access to master drug list. And this is no joke, because master drug list on an infusion pump has information like what patient will get what drug and what dosage, what proportion. You can also override the soft and hard limits, which basically defeats the whole purpose of safety measures on the infusion pump, which we thought was not cool. So anyways, these were some of the vulnerabilities that we discovered in the infusion pump. I think we are still working on it on and off to update the presentation if something else comes up. All right, my order. let's move on to the next case study. All right, so the next device we looked at was a digital pen. The medical practitioners and doctors use it to write prescription. So they would use this pen to write prescription on a special paper, which would then be transmitted to the pharmacy. So you can think of it as just a glorified fax machine. The benefits, they say, are that by the time you reach a pharmacy, they would have already received your medication and then would have gotten ready. These kind of pens are manufactured by different manufacturers. We only looked at one device from one manufacturer, and this is not the right picture for it. The workflow-wise is connected to a hospital's private network, either on through Ethernet or Wi-Fi, and then it breaks out using the hospital's enterprise gateway to the cloud. On the cloud side, there are three components. There was a web portal where patients could log in, manufacturers could log in, doctors could log in. There's an application server and a database server as well. Right. So initial observation, we found out that the pen itself was running Windows 10 operating system, so at least it wasn't Windows 7. It came pre-configured with two different accounts. One was for nurse, physician, and this is the account what your medical practitioner would use when they use the pen. And then there's an administrator account, which I suppose would be used by manufacturers to update the device and make any changes to it. And I'm the other person who used that account. Then it also had a USB port, capability to connect over Ethernet and Wi-Fi, HDMI, VGA, digital display, audio port. It came with fully updated Windows Defender. There was also a docking station, so you could dock the pen on it. It'll charge. And there's also a software layer which comprised of two applications that came from the manufacturer. Use case scenario, I just basically talked about it. This pen would typically be deployed at a nurse's station. Doctors can carry it around when they go see the patient. They can write the prescription with a special paper. At the time of writing, if the pen is connected to the internet, it will transmit the data to the portal in the real time. And if it's not connected to the internet, it will save that prescription in an encrypted manner on the disk itself, and then it will be transmitted to the portal when it connects back to the internet. The data was transmitted over the wire that was protected, SSL. So there wasn't much there. There was also a remote access component to it. So when you boot up the pen, because it had HDMI and USB ports, so you can connect a monitor to it. You can connect mouse and keyboard to it, and it boots up automatically. So you don't have to log in. It automatically boots up into Windows 10 using the nurse account, which is a locked mode account. So thinking from a typical pen tester perspective, my first goal was to escalate privileges on it so that we get local administrator access so that we can do much more with it. So we looked at different avenues, looked at different exploit codes that are out there for Windows 10. None of them really worked. We didn't have privileges to start or stop any of the services that were deployed. But then we found this one service, which was actually from the manufacturer, from one of the two applications that the manufacturer has. And so although we couldn't start or stop this particular service, we were able to overwrite the binary, service binary on the disk. So we created a malicious binary which had a simple payload which would create a local administrator account, replaced it with the binary, and then just rebooted the pen because we couldn't restart the service. So we just rebooted the pen. And so that worked. It got executed, and it created a local admin account. And at this point of time, we had admin access. So we could do a lot of things. We could install tools on it. So we installed Wireshark initially to start to look at the network traffic. But like I mentioned, the traffic was encrypted. There wasn't much in there. The next thing we did was we installed Windows System Internal Utility, so specifically procmon. And so if you've worked with procmon, you would notice that it generates tons of tons of queries. It captures a lot of traffic. And although you can create filters to just capture queries from one particular application, you still end up with a lot of data. Went through the different logs that came, the capture from procmon. It took a lot of time. But like one thing we noticed was that the application would query something called a .enc file. And query this file. So we located this file, and we figured that it would be an encrypted file, and we verified it because I opened it in Notepad, and it was garbage. So definitely an encrypted file. So as I mentioned before, I'm a wannabe reverse engineer, so that was my chance to reverse engineer. So I put Ollie debugger on to the Windows 10 operating system. It's a system-level debugger, doesn't read any installation, so that worked well for us. So essentially, what the application was doing was that it would open this .enc file and read certain contents and then exit. So after doing some dynamic and static reverse engineering, found out that the block on your left is the code, basically, that decrypts the file. So started reverse engineering this logic of decryption. Once I had that down, created a simple Python script that will just simply locate the file, decrypt the file, and then copy the contents to a different file so that we view it later. Again, heavily redacted file. So it had a bunch of data in there, but most importantly, there was a database string in there. So there was a host name for a MySQL database, username. As you can see, the username is root, which is the highest privileged user. Password in there. And so we thought, OK, like maybe this file is redundant, that they aren't really using it. And then even if they are, there's no way to expose that database to the internet. But like I had to do an nmap run. So, and indeed, they were like exposing it to the internet. And even at this point of time, I'm thinking, this is feeling more like those OSCP, CTF type things, where like they want you to think that there's a vulnerability, but it's not really there. But I tried to connect to the database, and it worked. And so at this point of time, we had, so like when I started looking at this pen, I thought, like, OK, this looks like this doesn't do much. In the worst case scenario, I'll probably just be able to grab 1 or 2 prescriptions off the hard disk. And that's the most I can do. And then with access to the database server, where you can basically gain access to the patient data from all the medical institutions where the pens are deployed, and not just where our test pen was. So like all over. So there was tons of data in there. So again, the data is redacted, but if you look at the headers of the table, there's patient code, there's patient first name, patient last name, date of birth, gender of the patient. We found another table that contained the username, user email, password in plain text for the portal itself. And then there's something called the role code, which basically tells if the user is just a patient, a doctor, manufacturer, administrator. So we grabbed one of the manufacturers and logged on to one of the facilities or one of the healthcare institutions as manufacturer. And again, we can pull out data like resident name, your unit, their home address, room number. SCN is the health card number for that particular patient. So like, and then thousands of records in there. And finally, we were also able to pull out all the prescriptions that were written by the doctors for all the patients across all the medical institutions. Right, so these are some of the findings we found in these 2 medical devices. As a closing remark, they're pretty generic. I think there's a lot of rush in getting the medical devices or IoT or internet-connected devices out to the market. And so like what's happening is that they're just bolting security onto them, and they're not building into the security. Hospitals already have a lot of connected medical devices, and that's only going to grow. So as long as, like, if they continue to trust those medical devices which are connected to the network, it's going to create more and more threat scenarios for the hospital networks. FDA has started to do quite a lot in terms of regulations for medical devices, but also we also need to go beyond regulations to really make sure that those devices are secure. So like one of the things with medical devices, as per FDA regulations, once a device is approved by FDA and deployed in a hospital, you can't modify that device. So even if you know that there's a default password, you can't really change that password because the device might behave in an unintended manner. So whatever the reason might be behind that, but that leaves IT technicians at the hospitals with kind of a black box, and they can't really do much about it. And none of the vulnerabilities that I really talked about today are really 0 days. They're all known vulnerabilities. Like we've already gone through with all these issues with web applications, other hardwares, and so on. I think it'll be easier to just learn from past mistakes and then while building the new products. And that's it for me. Thank you. Any questions? Am I on time? Okay, I'm on time. Thanks, everyone.